The first thing Garrett Vane ever asked me was whether I could cook for 9, and I have thought many times since about how a whole life can turn on a question that plain. I was standing in the yard of his ranch on the Sweetwater with the sun going down behind the cottonwoods and a swelling under my left eye that I had stopped trying to hide. He looked at me the way a man looks at a horse that has been run too hard by somebody else. Not pity. I could not have borne pity that day. It was closer to plain assessment, a man working out whether there was anything left in the animal worth feeding through the winter. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I had walked the last 6 miles. The freighter who carried me out of Rollins would only take me as far as the fork where the road to the Vane place left the road to the Sweetwater Bridge, and after that I went on foot with my husband's old leather trunk balanced on my shoulder and his Bible wrapped in a flour sack inside my coat. The trunk was not heavy with belongings. I owned almost nothing by then, but I would not set it down on the road, and I would not leave it. And so I carried it the way you carry the only thing that is still yours. A woman had told me in town that the Vanes needed a cook. She told me the last one had quit after the spring branding and the hands had been eating their own bad bachelor food for 2 months, and that Garrett Vane was particular but fair, and that he paid in coin and not in promises. I had no references and no clean dress and a face that announced where I had come from before I could open my mouth. But I had cooked for threshing crews in Nebraska as a girl, and I had fed my husband and his brother and 4 hired men through 3 haying seasons before everything broke apart, and I knew what it was to put a meal in front of hungry men who would judge me by it. So when Garrett Vane asked me, standing there in his own yard with his thumbs in his belt and his hat pushed back, "Can you cook for 9?" I did not flinch, and I did not soften it. "I can cook for 9, and I can cook for 12 if you've got 12, I said. "I can cook through a roundup, and I can stretch a beef so the men don't notice it's stretched. I'm asking for the work. I'm not asking for anything else." He did not answer right away. That was the first thing I learned about Garrett Vane, that he was a man who let a silence sit until it had told him what he needed to know. He looked at the trunk on my shoulder. He looked at the way I held my left arm a little against my ribs, which I had not meant for him to see. He looked at my hands, and I let him, because my hands were the one part of me I was not ashamed of. They were a working woman's hands, scarred along the knuckles, strong across the palm, and they told the truth about me even when the rest of me was telling a story about somebody else's anger. "Pap," he said, not loud, and an old man came out of the bunkhouse wiping his fingers on a rag. "This is—" He stopped. He realized he had not asked my name. "Cora," I said. "Cora Brandt." Something moved across his face when I said Brandt, and I understood later that he knew the name, that everybody in that part of the territory knew the Brandt place on Crowfoot Creek and knew the family that ran it. But he did not say anything about it then. He just nodded and turned back to the old man. "This is Mrs. Brandt. She's cooking for us, starting tonight if she's willing. Show her the kitchen and the cookhouse and where she'll sleep." He looked at me again. "There's a room off the kitchen. It has a bolt on the inside of the door. You decide who comes through it and when." I have thought about that sentence many times too. A man who had been told nothing about me, who had asked me nothing about the bruise on my face, had looked at me for less than a minute and understood the one thing I most needed to hear. That the door would be mine. That I would decide. The old man was named Linus Oakley, but everyone called him Pap, and he had been on the Vane ranch since Garrett's father ran it. He carried my trunk for me without asking, and when I started to protest, he said, "I've got 2 good arms, and you've got one you're favoring, so let's not argue about it." And that settled it. He walked me through the cookhouse, which was a long, low building with a plank table that seated a dozen, and into the kitchen, which had a good iron range and a dry larder and a window that faced east toward the creek. The little room off the kitchen had a rope bed and a washstand and the bolt Garrett had promised, and a window of its own, and I set my trunk down at the foot of the bed and felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for 2 years. I want to tell this right, which means I have to go back, because you cannot understand what that kitchen meant to me unless you understand what I had walked out of. I married Samuel Brandt in the spring of 1876 in a little Methodist church in Dawson County, Nebraska, and we came west into Wyoming territory the next year with a wagon and a milk cow, and the kind of plans young people make when they have never yet been disappointed by anything large. Samuel filed a homestead claim on 160 acres along Crowfoot Creek, good bottomland with water that ran most of the year, which on that range was worth more than gold, and everyone knew it. We built a soddy first, and then a log house. We broke the ground, and we ran a few cattle, and we proved up the claim the slow, honest way. 5 years of residence and improvement, and Samuel walked into the land office in Rollins and made his final proof, and the patent came through with the seal of the General Land Office. On it, the land was ours, free and clear and ground we had bled into. Samuel's brother Reuben came out from Nebraska the year after we proved up. He had failed at 2 things back home, and he came west the way some men do, certain that the country owed him the success he had not managed to earn anywhere else. Samuel took him in, because that is the kind of man Samuel was, and Reuben worked the place alongside us and slept in a lean-to off the barn and told everyone in town that he and his brother ran the Crowfoot together. He had a way of talking that put himself at the center of any story. Samuel let it go. Samuel let a great many things go. In the autumn of 1882, my husband went out to bring in strays before a storm, and his horse went down on the ice along the creek and rolled on him. And he lived 3 days, and then he did not. I held his hand when he died. The last clear thing he said to me, the last thing before the fever in his chest took his sense, was about the Bible. He said, "Cora, it's all in the Bible. You keep the Bible safe." I thought he meant his faith. I thought it was a dying man telling his wife to hold to the Lord. I held the Bible to my chest at his grave, and I did not understand for 2 years what he had truly been telling me. Reuben buried his brother, and then he ran the ranch as though it had always been his. And within a month he had moved into the house and moved me into the lean-to. And within a season he had stopped pretending there was any version of the future in which I was anything but unpaid hands. I cooked and I washed and I gardened and I tended the milk cows, and Reuben drank, and when Reuben drank he found reasons. The first time he struck me, I told myself it was the grief in him, that he had loved his brother too. I told myself a great many things in those 2 years. The bruises do not care what you tell yourself. They come up the same color whatever the reason. I stayed because I did not know I had anywhere to go. I want to be honest about that, because people who have never been inside that kind of life ask why a woman does not simply leave. And the answer is that the walls of it are built so slowly you do not notice you are inside until the door is already behind you. Reuben told me the land was his by right, that a brother inherits before a wife, that I was lucky he kept me on at all out of Christian duty. He said it so often and so plainly that I believed it. I had no money of my own. I could read a recipe and a hymn and not much past that. I did not know what a deed was, or where one lived, or what it could do. I knew the soddy and the creek and the long winters and the sound of Reuben's boots on the porch, which I learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. What finally moved me was small. It is always something small. One evening that last August, he came in from town drunker than usual, and he picked up Samuel's Bible off the shelf where I kept it, and he said he was going to use the pages to start the stove because they were no good for anything else, and he laughed while he said it. I took it out of his hands. I do not remember deciding to. I just had it against my chest, and I was standing between him and the stove, and he hit me hard enough that I went into the wall, and the lamp came down, and in the confusion of the spilled oil and the dark, I went out the door with the Bible still in my arms, and I did not stop walking. I walked to the Hendrys, our nearest neighbors, for miles, and Mrs. Hendry put me in their wagon at first light and took me to Rollins, and in Rollins a woman at the church told me the Vane ranch needed a cook. That is the whole of how I came to be standing in Garrett Vane's yard with a swollen eye and a dead man's Bible, asking for work and nothing else. The first night I cooked for 9 men, I made a beef stew with dumplings and a pan of biscuits and a dried apple cobbler, and I served it on the long plank table while the lamps burned, and the men came in off the range hungry and suspicious. They had heard a woman had come, and they had heard whose woman she had been, and ranch hands are not gentle with newcomers. There was a young one named Toby Hale who could not have been 20, and a black man named Mose who had cooked some himself and watched me the closest, and a quiet Mexican vaquero named Ramon who had the best manners of any of them, and Dutch and Cleve and 2 brothers named Pruitt and Old Pap, and Garrett at the head of the table. Nobody said much while they ate. That is the highest praise a hungry crew gives. When the cobbler was gone, Mose carried his plate back to the kitchen himself, which a hand does not do for a cook. He means to run off. And he set it in the wash water and looked at me and said, "Ma'am, that's the first food I've been glad to eat since April." And Toby, who had no guard on his face at all, said, "Are you staying?" like a boy asking whether Christmas was real, and the whole table went quiet waiting on the answer, and I looked down the length of it at Garrett Vane. "I'm staying," I said. "If the cooking suits." "It suits," Garrett said, and went back to his coffee, and that was the whole of my hiring confirmed. I will not pretend the next weeks were easy, because nothing about a body that has been taught to expect to blow heels on a schedule. For the first while I jumped when a door slammed, and I flinched when a man raised his hand to scratch his head, and I bolted my little door every night and lay awake listening. But the Vane Ranch was a different country from the Crowfoot. The men were rough, but they were not cruel, and rough men who are not cruel will surprise you with their kindness once they decide you belong to the outfit. Pap fixed the loose board on my doorstep without being asked. Ramon left wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill in a tin cup and pretended he had not. Toby chopped my stove wood every morning before light and stacked it higher than I could use. And when I told him it was too much, he turned red and said a cook ought to never run short, which I think was the longest sentence he had spoken to a woman in his life. And Garrett Vane left me alone in exactly the way I needed to be left alone, which is to say he was always near and never close. He ate what I cooked, and he thanked me for it plainly, and he did not look at my face when the bruise was at its worst, not because he was repelled, but because he understood that being looked at was its own kind of weight. He was a widower. I learned that from Pap, not from him. His wife Ellen had died bearing their first child 8 years before, and the child with her, and Garrett had done what men of that stamp do, which is to put his grief into the ground, and the cattle, and the long hours, and the building of a thing that could not be taken from him by fever or weather or God. He had built the Vane Ranch up from his father's modest start into the second largest outfit on that stretch of the Sweetwater. He had everything a man could want except the one thing, and he had stopped, by every account, expecting to want it. The trouble with the Vane Ranch, the thing the men talked about low around the bunkhouse stove, was water. Garrett ran more cattle than the range could reliably water in a dry year, and the past 2 years had been dry. His deeded ground had the river along its eastern edge, but the river was low and the upper pastures depended on a string of springs and seeps that had begun to fail. He had been buying hay and hauling water to the far tanks at a cost that ate his profit, and he had been looking, Pap told me, for some way to secure a senior water right on one of the creeks that fed the country above his range. Without it, a bad enough drought could break even an outfit as solid as the Vane. I listened to all of this the way a cook listens, while my hands were busy and my face gave nothing away, and I filed it without knowing yet why it mattered. I did not know yet that the answer to Garrett Vane's whole problem was sitting in a flour sack at the foot of my bed, sewn into the binding of a dead man's Bible, waiting for me to finally have the safety to open it. A month into my time on the Vane Ranch, the first word from Reuben reached me. It came through town, the way things do. A freighter told Pap, and Pap told Garrett. And Garrett came into the kitchen one evening after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and stood with his hat in his hands in a way I had not seen from him before, like a man bracing to deliver bad news gently. "Reuben Brandt's been asking after you and Rollins," he said, "telling folks his brother's widow run off touched in the head, and he means to bring her home where she belongs. Telling it loud, and telling it sorrowful, the way a man does when he wants the story set before the truth can get its boots on." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you so you're not surprised. On this ground you're under my name, and the law's the same for everyone. But I'd rather you knew." I stood at the range with my back to him for a moment because I did not want him to see my face, and then I made myself turn around. "He'll say I'm not right in the head," I said. "He'll say I'm his to look after. He'll say the land is his, and I'm part of the land." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "He's been saying it for 2 years. The hard part is I half believe it myself." "Do you?" Garrett said. It was not quite a question. He told me the land passed to him. A brother before a wife. He told me I had nothing, and I should be grateful. I wiped my hands on my apron though they were already dry. I never saw a paper either way. Samuel handled all of that. I wouldn't know how to read it if I had it. Garrett was quiet a moment in that way he had. "Samuel Brandt proved up the Crowfoot," he said slowly. "I remember it. Everyone on this range remembers it, because that creek bottom has the best water for 20 miles, and we all wondered how a quiet Nebraska man got there first." He looked at me steadily. "A patent doesn't pass to a brother because the brother says so, Mrs. Brandt. There's law about it. There's paper about it. Whatever Reuben Brandt's been telling you, it's worth less than the breath it took. I did not sleep that night. Not from fear, or not only from fear. Something Samuel had said was turning over in my mind. The way a thing you have buried will work its way up through the ground after a hard rain. It's all in the Bible, Cora. You keep the Bible safe. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I had carried that Bible for 2 years, and I had read from it most nights, and I had never once thought there was anything in it but scripture and the family record on the page in front, where Samuel had written our marriage and would have written our children if we had been given any. I had never thought about why he said it the way he said it, dying, with his last clear breath spent not on the Lord but on a book. The next morning, after the men had eaten and gone out and the kitchen was mine, I took the Bible out of the flour sack and I sat down at the plank table in the cookhouse with the east light coming through the window, and I looked at it the way I had never let myself look at it. It was a good Bible, a heavy one, the kind a family buys once and keeps forever, with a thick leather cover gone soft at the corners from handling. I had always thought it heavy because it was a large book, but I set it on the scale I used for flour, on a whim, the way you do a thing without knowing why, and it weighed more than its size. I held it up to the light and I pressed along the spine and the boards, and along the back cover, under the leather, my thumb found an edge that had no business being there. A straightness. A seam where the binding should have been whole. My heart was going hard. I want to be truthful about that, because the stories people tell make these moments calm, and it was not calm. My hands were shaking the way they shook when I heard Reuben's boots on the porch, except this was a different thing entirely. This was hope. And hope in a body that has learned not to hope is almost the same feeling as fear. I got the small knife I used for paring, and I worked it gentle under the leather of the back cover where the seam was, and the old paste gave way, and the leather peeled back, and underneath it the board of the cover had been split and hollowed by hand, and the hollow had been filled, and folded into the hollow were papers. 3 of them, folded small and pressed flat for 2 years under leather, and against my own heart, every night, without my knowing. I unfolded them on the plank table with the morning light on them, and I smoothed them flat with both hands the way you smooth out a thing you are afraid to tear, and I read them as well as I could read, which was slowly, sounding the long words. And then I read them again. And then I sat very still in the cookhouse of the Vane ranch with my hands flat on those 3 papers, and I understood what my husband had spent his last breath trying to tell me. The first paper was the Homestead patent itself. The final certificate from the General Land Office, with the printed eagle at the top and the seal pressed into it, granting to Samuel Brandt the southeast quarter of Section 14, in Township 28 North, Range 90 west of the 6th principal meridian, 160 acres, to have and to hold the said tract together with the appurtenances thereunto belonging. Crowfoot Creek ran through that quarter section. The water right ran with the land. It was all there in the dry, careful language of the government, the land that Samuel and I had bled into, granted to us by the United States. The second paper was the one that mattered most, and reading it was the moment my whole life turned a second time. It was a deed, a warranty deed, drawn up plain and proper, in which Samuel Brandt conveyed the whole of that quarter section, the Crowfoot homestead and all its water and all its appurtenances, to his wife, Cora Brandt, her heirs and assigns forever, in fee simple. It was signed in Samuel's hand. It was witnessed by 2 names I recognized, the Hendrys, our neighbors. It was notarized and stamped across the bottom. In the faded purple ink of the county recorder was the date it had been filed and recorded in the records of Carbon County, more than a year before Samuel died. He had done it quietly. I understood that now. He had drawn up that deed and ridden to Rollins and recorded it. And he had told no one, not Reuben, not even me. And he had hidden the original in the one thing he knew I would keep through any fire or flood or grief. He had seen something in his brother that I had not let myself see while Samuel lived. He had known, the way a careful man knows, that he might not always be there to stand between his wife and the world, and he had built me a wall out of paper and hidden the key inside his scripture, and he had spent his dying breath telling me where to find it. The land was mine. It had been mine since before Samuel died. Every day Reuben Brandt had spent on the Crowfoot. Every day he had called it his, and called me a burden and raised his hand to me in my own house. He had been a trespasser on land that the law of the United States said belonged to Cora Brandt, her heirs and assigns forever. The third paper was a letter, in Samuel's hand, short, and I will not write all of it here, because some words a woman keeps for herself. But it ended by saying that he had done this because he loved me, and because he did not fully trust his brother, and that if I was reading it, then something had happened to him, and that I was to take the deed to a lawyer in Rollins named Theodore Ashe who had drawn it and would stand behind it, and that I was not to let anyone tell me the crow foot was not mine, because it was, and the paper proved it. And paper does not grieve, and paper does not get tired, and paper does not back down. I sat in that cookhouse until the light moved off the table. Then I folded the papers, and I put them in my apron pocket against my body, and I went and found Garrett Vane. He was in the horse barn doctoring a gelding's hoof, and he looked up when I came in, and he saw my face, and he set the hoof down and stood up, because whatever was on my face was not a small thing, and he could read it. "I need to go to Rollins," I said. "I need to find a lawyer named Theodore Ashe. And I need you to look at something, because I've only got my own reading to go on, and I've been wrong about what's mine for 2 years, and I can't be wrong about it again." I took the papers out of my apron, and I laid them on a clean board, and I told him what I thought they were, and Garrett Vane read them in the barn light with his hat off, slowly, the patent, and then the deed, and then he read the deed again, the way he read everything twice. And when he finished, he stood for a long moment looking at the recorder's stamp at the bottom of the deed. And then he looked at me, and something had changed in his face that I had not seen there before. "Mrs. Brandt," he said, and his voice was careful, "do you understand what you've got here?" "I think so," I said. "I'm afraid to. This deed was recorded 14 months before your husband died." He set it down gentle, like it might break. "That means it doesn't matter what Reuben Brandt thinks he inherited, because there was nothing left to inherit. Your husband gave you the crow foot while he was alive, and he put it on the county record where any man could have found it if he'd thought to look. Reuben never looked. He's been squatting on your land for 2 years telling you it was his, and the courthouse in Rollins has had the truth filed away the whole time." He shook his head slowly. "Lord, that creek bottom, that water. There's more I have to tell you," I said, "and you may not thank me for it, because I had understood, sitting in the cookhouse, what the water on the Crow Foot meant to a man whose whole outfit was failing for want of it. Crowfoot Creek is the senior right on the upper Sweetwater drainage. You've been hunting 2 years for a way to secure water above your range. The Crow Foot is that water, and it's mine." Garrett Vane looked at me for a long time in the barn, and I will tell you honestly, I did not know what was in his face, whether it was the rancher seeing his salvation or the man seeing the woman in front of him. And I think the truth is that he did not fully know either. But what he said was this: "We'll go to Rollins tomorrow. Pap can run the kitchen a day. We'll find your lawyer, and we'll make certain the recording is clean, and we'll find out exactly what you own." He picked his hat up off the rail. "What you do with it after that is yours to decide, Cora. All of it. I'll not say a word about water or range or anything else until your land is safe in your own hands, and you've had time to stand on it and know it's yours. I'd not have you confuse one thing for another." It was the first time he had called me Cora. We rode into Rollins the next day in the buckboard, and we found the office of Theodore Ashe above the dry goods store, and he was an older man with spectacles and ink on his fingers, and when I laid the deed on his desk and said my name, his whole face changed. "Cora Brandt," he said softly. "I drew this deed. Samuel came to me. He swore me to keep it close." He took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. I'd wondered after he passed. I'd heard the brother was running the place, and I wondered why you never came. I thought perhaps Samuel had changed his mind, or that you knew and chose to let it lie. I'm an attorney, Mrs. Brandt. I couldn't go knocking on your door telling you what you owned. The client was dead, and the matter was sealed." He put his spectacles back on and looked at the deed with the satisfaction of a careful man seeing his careful work hold. "But it's here. It's recorded. It's good. It has been good every single day." He sent his clerk to the courthouse, and within the hour the clerk came back with a certified copy of the recording from the county book, the very entry stamped on my deed, matching it line for line. Mr. Ashe laid the original and the certified copy side by side on his desk and tapped them both. "Here is where you stand," he said. "You are, and have been since the recording of this deed, the sole owner in fee simple of the Crow Foot Homestead, 160 acres, together with all water rights appurtenant, which on Crowfoot Creek are senior and substantial. Reuben Brandt has no claim to any part of it. He never did. He has been in adverse possession, which under the law might in time ripen into a claim. But the time required is far longer than 2 years, and his possession was anything but peaceable toward the rightful owner, which is to say he beat and confined the woman who held the title. His mouth went hard. No court in this territory will find for that man. What he owes you, by contrast, may be considerable. Back rents on your own land. Damages for the cattle of yours he's converted to his use. We can pursue all of it. I sat in that chair, and I felt the 2 years lift off me like a wet coat coming off in a warm room. What is it worth? Garrett asked quietly. He had stayed by the door the whole time, hat in his hands, saying nothing, true to his word. The land. The water. What's the figure? Ash, so she knows what she's standing on. Mr. Ash named a figure for the land, the bottomland and the improvements. That was more money than I had ever held or imagined holding. And then he said that the water right, properly proved and recorded and protected, was worth more than the land itself in a country growing as fast as this one, because every outfit on the upper Sweetwater needed it and dry years were coming more often. And a senior right on the best creek for 20 miles was the kind of thing a woman could lease for income every season for the rest of her life and pass to her heirs and never sell at all. He said the number slow, and he said it twice, the way you say a thing to someone who has been taught to expect nothing. I did not weep in that office. I had done my weeping over 2 years, and I was finished with it. But I put my hand flat on the deed, on Samuel's signature, and I sat very still, and Garrett Vane looked at the floor and gave me my moment. Mr. Ash drew up the papers that afternoon. A formal notice to Reuben Brandt that he was in unlawful possession of land belonging to Cora Brandt and was to vacate it. A claim for back rents and damages. A confirmation of my title to be filed with the court so that it stood as a matter of public record beyond any whisper. And, at my asking, a quiet letter to the county sheriff so that when the notice was served there would be law standing behind it and no man would have to face Reuben Brandt alone. We rode back to the Vane ranch in the long gold evening, and for a while neither of us spoke, and then Garrett said, not looking at me, he'll come. I know, I said. When a man like that is told the thing he stole was never his, he doesn't go quiet. He comes to argue, or worse. He kept his eyes on the team. On this ground you've got 9 men and a deed in the law. He's got a story nobody believes anymore. But I'd not have you think it'll be nothing. I stopped thinking it would be nothing a long time ago, I said. I just stopped being the only one standing in front of it. Reuben Brandt came on a Sunday, 10 days after the notice was served. I knew him by the sound of his horse before I saw him, which tells you something about what 2 years can teach a body. I was in the kitchen, and the men were mostly at the bunkhouse, it being Sunday, and I heard a hard-ridden horse come into the yard, and I knew. I went out onto the cookhouse step with my hands in my apron, and I made myself stand straight. He looked smaller than I remembered. That surprised me. In my memory, he had filled doorways. In the Vane ranch yard, with the deeds certified at the courthouse and 9 men's worth of outfit around me, he was just a thick, angry man on a tired horse, red in the face, with a paper crumpled in his fist that I knew was Mr. Ash's notice. You, he said, and he came off the horse before it had fully stopped. You ungrateful. After everything I'd done for you, you send lawyers? You send the sheriff to my place? It was never your place, I said. He came toward me fast, the way he always had, the way that for 2 years had made me step back and make myself small. I felt my body want to do it, the old learned cringe, and I held my ground instead, and I think that surprised him more than anything, because he stopped short. Garrett Vane came around the corner of the cookhouse without hurry. He must have heard the horse too. He had not brought a gun. He had his hands empty at his sides and his hat low, and he came and stood beside me, not in front of me, beside me, close enough that the meaning was plain, the same way he had once set my plate at the table like the most ordinary thing in the world. And behind him, drifting up from the bunkhouse without being called, came Pap and Mose and Ramon and Toby and Dutch and the Pruitt brothers and Cleve, 8 men, ranged loose across the yard, not crowding, just present, just there, so that Reuben Brandt understood the shape of where he was standing. Mr. Brandt, Garrett said, easy as anything. You're on my ground now, and the lady you're shouting at holds title to 160 acres you've been living on for 2 years that were never yours. I expect you've read the notice, since you're waving it. So you know how this goes. You vacate the crow foot. You account for the cattle. And if you ever raise your voice to this woman again, on my ground or anywhere in this county, you'll answer for every bruise the law can count, and I'll see to it the count is thorough. Reuben looked from Garrett to the ranged men to me, and I watched the certainty go out of him the way water goes out of a creek in a dry summer, slow and then all at once. He had built his whole life on the story that he was owed and that I was nothing, and the story had just been read out loud in front of witnesses and found to be false in every particular. And a man like that, when his story breaks, has nothing left to stand on. He left it to me, Reuben said, but the bluster was gone out of it. I'm his brother. I'm blood. He left it to his wife, I said, 14 months before he died, and he recorded it in Rollins. And he hid the deed where he knew you'd never think to look, because he knew you, Reuben. He knew you better than I let myself. He spent his last words telling me where to find it. I took the certified copy out of my apron, because I had taken to carrying it, and I held it up, not close enough for him to grab, just close enough for him to see the stamp. It was always mine. Every day you told me I was nothing, it was already mine. You just never read the paper. I will not pretend I felt nothing watching him. I had thought, in the worst of those 2 years, that I would feel triumph at a moment like this, that I would want to give him back some measure of what he had given me. But standing there in the yard, I found that what I felt was mostly tired, and under the tiredness something quieter, something I can only call relief, that it was ending without a gun, without blood, the way Samuel would have wanted, the way a deed ends things, on paper, in daylight, with witnesses. Reuben got back on his horse. He looked at me one more time, and whatever he meant to say, he did not say it. Maybe because Garrett was watching him with that stillness that is more convincing than any anger. Maybe because there was finally nothing left to say. He turned the horse, and he rode out of the Vane yard and out of my life, and the sheriff and Mr. Ash handled the rest of it, the accounting and the back rents, over the weeks that followed, all on paper, all in daylight. Reuben left the territory before the snow. I never saw him again. I do not think about him as often as you might expect. What I think about is the kitchen. I went back to cooking for 9, because the crow foot was mine, but the harvest of being free does not come in all at once, and the work steadied me the way work always had. But it was different work now. Now when I stood at the range, I was a woman who owned 160 acres of the best bottomland on the upper Sweetwater, with a water right men would pay handsomely to lease, and I stood differently, and the men felt it, and they were proud of it the way an outfit is proud of its own. Toby still chopped my wood too high. Ramon still left the wildflowers. But now they did it for a landowner who chose to cook their suppers, not for a stray who had nowhere else. And that is a different thing, and I felt the difference in my own spine every morning when I lit the stove. Garrett kept his word. He did not say a word about water or range until the land was safe in my hands, and the court had confirmed my title, and the whole county knew the crow foot was Cora Brandt's. He waited until a clear, cold evening late in the fall when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and I had banked the stove, and he came and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands the way he had the night he told me Reuben was asking after me. And I knew before he spoke that the thing between us that we had both been careful not to name had finally come to be named. I have to say 2 things, Garrett said, and I have to say them in the right order, because if I say them wrong you'll think I'm asking for one when I'm asking for the other, and I'd not have you confuse them as long as I live. I dried my hands on my apron, and I waited, the way I had learned to let his silences sit. The first thing is about the water, he said. Your crow foot right could save this outfit in a dry year, and a dry year is coming. They always are. Any man with sense would want to lease it from you, and I'd pay you fair, more than fair, and we'd both come out ahead, and there'd be nothing in it but business. I want you to know that's there. I want you to know it's yours to grant or keep, and that it stands entirely apart from the second thing, and that if you only ever wanted to talk to me about the first thing, I'd shake your hand on it and be glad. He turned his hat once in his hands. The second thing, he said, I've been trying not to say since the evening you stood in my yard and told me you weren't asking for anything but the work. I told myself a woman that bruised and that brave didn't need a man making calf eyes at her. She needed a wage and a bolt on her door and to be left be. So I left you be. I've been leaving you be for the better part of a year, and I've watched you come back to yourself a little more every week, and watching you do it has been the finest thing I've seen in 8 years, and I'm done leaving you be." His voice was rough now, the way the inspiration of a careful man's heart roughens it when he finally lets it out. "I'm not asking because of the water, Cora. I'd want you if you own not 1 acre and not 1 drop. I'd want you if you came to my door tomorrow with nothing but the apron you're wearing. The water is the first thing, and it doesn't matter. You're the second thing, and you're the only thing. I'm asking you to stay, not as my cook, as my wife. If you'll have a man who took a year too long to find the nerve." I stood in that kitchen, and I thought about the woman who had walked 6 miles up the road from the fork with a swollen eye and a dead man's Bible, certain she was nothing, certain she had nowhere to go and nothing to her name and nothing worth wanting. I thought about Samuel, who had loved me enough to build me a wall of paper and hide the key in his scripture so that no matter what happened to him, I would never be at the mercy of a man who told me I was nothing. He had spent his last breath making sure I would one day be standing exactly here, free and safe, and owning the ground under my own feet, able to choose. And I understood, standing there, that the deed had given me more than land. It had given me the one thing Reuben had spent 2 years taking from me, and that Garrett had spent a year quietly giving back. It had given me the standing to answer this question as a free woman and not a grateful one. I was not saying yes because I had nowhere to go. I had 160 acres to go. I was not saying yes because I needed a roof. I owned a roof on the Crow Foot, free and clear, waiting for me. I was saying yes because I wanted to, fully and on my own ground, the way Samuel had made certain I would always be able to. "You asked me once if I could cook for 9, I said. "Do you remember what I told you? You said you could cook for 12 if I had 12. Something moved in his face. "I've thought about it more than I should admit. "Then here's my answer to your second thing." I came across the kitchen to him. "Yes, I'll have you, Garrett Vane, and the water comes with me, not as a lease and not as a bargain, but as my half of a thing we'll own together. And I'll cook for 9 or 12, or however many men this outfit grows to, for the rest of my life, because I want to, not because I have to, and you'll never once mistake the difference, because I won't let you." My voice caught, just at the end, and I let it. I came up that road thinking I was nothing. 2 men taught me different. One of them spent his dying breath on it, and the other one waited a whole year to say a word so I'd have time to learn it on my own. I know what I'm worth now. I'm saying yes from the top of it. We married in the spring, in the same little church in Rollins where the churchwoman had once sent me out to find a cook's job, and most of the county came, because a thing like that deserves to be witnessed. Mr. Ash came and dabbed at his spectacles and pretended he had dust in his eye. The Hendrys came, who had witnessed Samuel's deed, and then put me in their wagon at first light. Pap gave me away, because I had no one else, and because he said an old man who had carried my trunk that first evening had earned the right. Toby cried and said he was not, the way Loretta had once, the way people do at the sight of a thing they did not expect to live to see, a hard story coming out right. We joined the Crow Foot to the Vane that summer, the deeds filed side by side in the county book, and the senior water right on Crowfoot Creek carried the Vane outfit through the dry years that came after, the years that broke smaller ranches all up and down the upper Sweetwater. And every season when the creek ran low and the cattle drank anyway, I thought of my husband Samuel riding quiet into Rollins to record a deed and tell no one. He had not lived to see the drought. He had seen it coming all the same. The worth of the Crow Foot was never in how it looked from the road, 160 acres of bottomland that any passing man would price at nothing. The worth was in the water that ran through it, and the paper that proved it, and in the patient love of a man who knew his brother and protected his wife against a future he would not be there to see. I keep the original deed in a strongbox now, with Samuel's letter folded beside it, and I keep his Bible on the shelf in the house Garrett and I share, mended where I cut the binding, the family record page filled in at last with a new marriage in my own hand. I take the deed out sometimes and smooth it flat on the table the way I did that first morning in the cookhouse, and I read the dry, careful words of the government and the careful hand of my first husband, and I am grateful in a way that has no bottom to it. A piece of paper saved my life. Not by itself. A piece of paper does not feed you or hold your hand or wait a year to speak so you can heal. People did those things. But the paper made the rest of it possible. The paper said, in the cold, plain language that does not grieve and does not tire and does not back down, that Cora Brandt was a free woman who owned the ground she stood on. And once a thing like that is written down and stamped and filed, no man's louder story can unwrite it. Samuel knew that. He spent his last breath telling me where the proof was hidden, and it took me 2 hard years to be safe enough to look. And when I finally looked, everything changed. Garrett Vane asked me, that first evening, whether I could cook for 9. I have thought many times since about how a whole life can turn on a question that plain. I answered yes. I have been answering yes every morning since, at the same stove, in the same kitchen, a free woman on her own ground. And the answer changed his whole ranch, and it changed mine, and it changed me most of all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.